Welcome back, history scholars. In this video, we're going to be talking about the post-Civil War period called Reconstruction, when we see what exactly is the United States going to do to put this whole country back together again after it's had this devastating, destructive war for 4 years. There's lots of questions that would have to come up in Reconstruction. Just how is the South going to be treated now that they are being added back to the Union? Should they be punished? Are they traitors to the United States? Is there going to be mass incarceration or executions for those who have fought against the United States? Or are we simply going to rejoin and put that whole chapter of the country behind us and move on as best we can with big changes that have come, obviously, the ending of slavery and slaves becoming citizens of the United States. Lots of big questions had to be answered now that 620,000 people had died in the war, and just insurmountable amounts of money have been spent by the North and destruction of the entire economy of the South in this war. So Reconstruction is basically a period from the end of the war, 1865, to 1877. That kind of brings us really toward the end of this course. And we're going to be looking specifically here in this brief video on what President Lincoln planned to do in Reconstruction, and then what President Andrew Johnson did, because Lincoln does not live very long into this Reconstruction, of course. And then ultimately the clash that's going to happen between President Johnson and Congress as they wrestle over what should happen in Reconstruction. Finally, we'll see how Southern states resisted Reconstruction. Notice the subtitle here, How the South Won the Civil War. Well, obviously they didn't actually win, but they may have prevailed in some ways during Reconstruction as far as how much they're going to change and how much they're going to retain from what had been before. So without further introduction, let's get into reconstructing the Union. First, we'll talk about presidential reconstruction. That is, what were the plans of these presidents at the end of the Civil War? Abraham Lincoln already had some plans for how he would reconstruct the Confederacy. Wherever American Union troops would take over, in a way, there was already Reconstruction going on, as Louisiana, for example, would be one of the early Southern states that fell. The U.S. Navy had captured New Orleans early in the war, and they really dominate the state pretty early on. So what's going to be happening in Louisiana politically, and who's going to be governing Louisiana, a lot of that's going to be under a Reconstruction kind of government. And Lincoln made it pretty plain through the example of Louisiana that his view was that once you have a population, 10% of the white male population, the voting public, when 10% of that population swears allegiance to the United States, and they put aside their animosity toward the United States, then they can constitute a new government. Just 10%. You don't need every citizen of the whole state to swear allegiance to the U.S. You just have a 10% that will swear allegiance, and then those people can write a new state constitution. They can elect new state officers, people to serve them in the U.S. Congress, and that's really all it would take to create a new state government. Now, for some people, especially other Republicans in Congress, that didn't seem like nearly enough. Lincoln is okay with just a 10% plan. He didn't have a great strategy for punishing those who have engaged in this war, or making sure that these Southern states are really going to be loyal to the Union in the future. In Lincoln's view, there was no such thing as secession from the Union. These Southern states only think that they've seceded, but really the Union is unbreakable. So they have been fighting this war because the Southern states are out of the right relationship with the rest of the Union. They don't realize that they're trying to break this bond that's really unbreakable. But for a lot of other Republicans in Congress, they thought Lincoln's plan is way too soft. It's way too generous for a people that have rebelled and caused so much death and destruction by seceding from the Union. There are others who say, yes, in fact, they did secede. They broke away from the Union and they must be punished for it. Lincoln seems okay with just a 10% plan. Now, he does insist that slavery is going to be no more. The 13th Amendment is going to ban slavery everywhere, not just in those states who rebelled against the Union, the Confederacy, but even in those border states who had never left the Union, even places like Missouri and Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware. Those were slave states that never left the Union. But the 13th Amendment makes it clear that slavery is going to be outlawed everywhere in the United States. Lincoln would insist that is going to be a condition. You must accept that slavery has come to an end. New state constitutions should accept that principle. But otherwise, Lincoln is okay with states just having that 10% that constitute a new government and then can be back in the right relationship with the United States. Well, of course, Abraham Lincoln is killed just days after the war is over. So other than those places that were already being taken over during the war, we never really get to see how Lincoln would have been in a long period of Reconstruction. Who knows? It may have gone much better under his leadership. Or it may have been that he had to suffer a long time with unpopularity during the difficult time of Reconstruction. We don't really know. We know Lincoln was killed. Because he's killed, when he was killed and how it was done, he becomes a martyr. He becomes America's favorite president of all time, even though his time in office was the most destructive time in American history. Lincoln is going to be remembered as a hero and a martyr to this country. So his successor, Andrew Johnson, becomes president, and many Republicans sort of thought this might be a good thing. Now, they lament the passing of Abraham Lincoln. He's their great leader. But for certain Republicans that wanted a tougher stance against the South, they thought Andrew Johnson might be better. They are secretly okay that Lincoln had been taken away, that he's died, and that Andrew Johnson might be a better person for Reconstruction. Now, why did they think that? Why do they think Andrew Johnson's going to be so tough on the South? Johnson's an interesting character here because Johnson is not really a Republican. He's a Democrat from Tennessee. But he was a Unionist Democrat. He disagreed with the majority of his state who wanted to break away from the U.S. He wanted Tennessee to stay in the Union. And Johnson, although he is a Democrat, Johnson despised the large plantation owners, the people that really dominated the South, their economy. Johnson's a poor, or grew up as a poor, uneducated white man. He really doesn't learn to read or get any kind of formal education until after he's married. He is very much a common, uneducated white man of the South. But as he did become to read, and he has such a thirst for learning at that point, he advances quite rapidly in politics. And as he becomes a lawyer, he advances quite rapidly and had a reputation for being really stubborn and principled. He was Tennessee's governor at the time of their breaking away from the Union. And he's not going to go along with it. He's the one Southern governor who was not happy to see them break away from the Union. And so he's not afraid to take an unpopular position and just still hold his ground stubbornly. That's what we could say about Andrew Johnson. If it's a virtue at all, being stubborn, well, he has that in large measure. So Johnson, a lot of Republicans assume Johnson will be harder on the South, especially those big plantation owners, be harder on them than Lincoln was, because he hates that part of the Confederacy so much. And he always disagreed with the South breaking away from the Union. Well, they turn out to be very disappointed in Andrew Johnson. Johnson seems okay with following a Lincoln-like plan. He wants there to be more like 50% of the population to swear allegiance to the United States. But once 50% have sworn allegiance, he's ready to admit states into the Union without a great deal of further change. Some people might have thought he's really going to punish those big plantation owners. Maybe he'll even strip them of their property and redistribute that property among the former slaves. But Johnson had no intention of doing something like that. He disagreed with plantation owners, but he did not cease to believe in property rights. You can be a bad person, but that doesn't mean someone can just come and take your property. So Johnson had no intention of making those further economic changes. Now, he's not going to just have a blanket pardon for everyone in the Confederacy. For those large plantation owners, he wants them to petition for his pardon. But he did seem to regularly grant them pardon when they would come and petition. So imagine this. This is a poor white man from Tennessee, and lots of wealthy plantation owners are going to be writing him or coming to the White House and begging him for a presidential pardon. Johnson liked that. There's a lot of his biographers who say he just kind of reveled in this reversal of fortune. Suddenly he's the power, and the wealthy and formerly powerful are having to come to him and say, please don't take our farm. Please don't take our plantation. Please let us have voting rights again. And Johnson will grant these pardons, but he does like the role of having them come to beg him. So Republicans, especially the group we would call the radical Republicans, they are bitterly disappointed that Andrew Johnson seems to be willing to go do about the same things that Lincoln would do, despite his animosity toward the wealthiest class in the South. And he's not going to insist on further great changes. In fact, shortly after Johnson comes into office, he's ready to admit these other states and say, Reconstruction is basically over. It's been a terrible, bitter war, but the states are back in the Union and he's ready to move forward. Now, radical Republicans have very different ideas. They aren't so ready to just move past the Civil War. They think there needs to be much greater changes, that there's got to be some things to make sure these freed slaves have their rights protected. And maybe there should be more grand economic changes. Maybe some people do need to be stripped of property or rights in order to correct injustices of the past. Okay. Radical Republicans are that branch of the Republican Party who wants the greatest changes in the South. And they continually find that they are butting heads with Andrew Johnson. When they try to pass Reconstruction bills that have to do with protecting the rights of African Americans or having greater oversight over those Confederate states, Andrew Johnson rejects those bills. He vetoes them. For example, there's an organization called the Freedmen's Bureau, and its purpose was to help educate freed slaves on what their rights are. help them. They've never been citizens. Supreme Court made that clear in the Dred Scott decision. But now that they are going to become citizens under the 14th Amendment, that's something else Southern new constitutions are going to have to accept, that they are, that freedmen are citizens of their state and of the nation. The Freedmen's Bureau is trying to educate them on what rights they have. Well, Johnson thought that was an organization that was maybe needed for the first year after the Civil War, but it has no need for a bigger budget or to continue afterward. He's ready to veto. So radical Republicans really get irritated with Andrew Johnson, and in fact, they look for a way to limit his power. Andrew Johnson ends up getting impeached. He's our first president to ever get impeached, and he's the closest one to ever getting actually removed from office because of his impeachment. An impeachment is really just a formal charges brought against you by Congress. The reason Congress brought charges against Andrew Johnson was they passed a law called the Tenure of Office Act. And it said, not only does the president have to have Congress's approval to get a cabinet member appointed, he has to have Congress's approval to remove someone from the cabinet. Now, Andrew Johnson saw this bill for what it was. It was just an attempt by Congress to limit the power of the presidency. And he wasn't going to tolerate it. He's pretty stubborn, So Andrew Johnson thought he would just test this law right away by firing Edward Stanton, who was the Secretary of War. Now, keep in mind, Johnson has become president simply because Lincoln was killed. He was vice president in that second term, so he's barely become vice president, and suddenly the assassination makes him president. He never got to choose a cabinet. His cabinet is the Lincoln cabinet. They aren't loyal to Johnson. They don't really look to him as the leader. So Edwin Stanton was a Lincoln man. In fact, he was a rival who wanted to be president himself. Andrew Johnson thought, Congress is not going to tell me I can't remove someone from a cabinet position. So he fires the man who was most responsible for running the war, outside the president. And so Republicans in Congress believed now we've got a reason to impeach him. He's violated the law, the Tenure of Office Act. He just ignored it. Well, Stanton really doesn't leave office either. He barricades himself inside the War Department, keeps, having food brought into him, but he doesn't leave. And now Congress starts impeachment proceedings and try to get the votes to get him removed. Well, they come within one vote of removing President Johnson. That means nearly 2/3 of Congress was ready to just kick him out of office and make someone else president. But they come one vote short of that. He really hadn't done anything. He irritated a lot of people. And he definitely took a position that now that the war is over, African Americans are on their own for how to make their way. They're not going to get a lot of national government support. So he irritated a lot of people. He offended people, but he hadn't really done anything illegal other than violating this law that Congress had just passed in order to tie his hands, in order to limit the presidency. And the Supreme Court would later say, yeah, that Tenure of Office Act, that's a violation of the separation of powers. They can't do that. So Johnson was impeached but not removed from office. But definitely radical Republicans would have more control in Reconstruction policy from then on. This is 1867. So we move really from the era of presidential Reconstruction to congressional lead in Reconstruction. Andrew Johnson can still try to veto the bills that Congress is passing, but they could usually get 2/3 to override his veto. They almost had 2/3 willing to just remove him from office. So radical Republicans have much more control. And after 1867, they're going to push for military rule in the South. they're not going to just admit all of these new states, like Lincoln seemed to be willing to do pretty quickly and Johnson was willing to do. Congressional Republicans now say, look, those southern states, the Confederacy, it's going to be broken into 5 military districts. And we're going to keep the army there. We're going to have military appointed generals who will be the governors of these regions. And, only when these places have met certain criteria, when we see that they follow the law, they're respecting the 13th and 14th Amendment. In fact, they're going to insist new constitutions, they should also include a 15th Amendment, or that show their support for a 15th Amendment. That is, that freed slaves, that freed slave men have the right to vote. They have to agree with these Reconstruction amendments. And then we can start to readmit these southern states into the Union. So taking a step back here, one example of why people in Congress were so adamant that more changes be made. Shortly after the war, when Georgia was ready to be readmitted into the Union, and they have elections, they send back congressmen to represent them. One of their congressmen was Alexander Stephens. He was the vice president of the Confederacy. So for a lot of Northern congressmen, that was unbelievable. The Southerners are electing the same kind of people that led them into the Civil War. Now, to be fair, Alexander Stephens was not really one who wanted war the most. He's a states' rights advocate. He definitely disagreed with the Lincoln presidency, but he was a high-ranking official in the Confederacy. And now Georgia, right after the war, they're ready to send him back to Congress. These Northern congressmen are going to say, no, that's enough. Military rule in the South. We're going to govern you for a while until you prove loyal enough and follow the law enough that we can admit you back in. But you're not going to send back Alexander Stephens and just have him sit as a congressman like nothing happened. So all of the southern states are going to be drafting new constitutions that accept these new amendments, and they're going to be ruled by Union soldiers. Really, they're going to be ruled by Republicans that they hadn't elected. At least the majority of them have not elected. They're not going to be allowed to make those selections yet, because radical Republicans are going to say, if you're a high-ranking official in the Confederacy, you are ineligible to vote in elections now. Not only will you not be their leaders, you're not going to take part in the democracy there. So quite a change here from Reconstruction under Andrew Johnson, who's ready to just put things behind him and say, we are reconstructed. And now congressional Reconstruction. Now, let me change gears a little bit and talk about ways that Southern states resisted Reconstruction. This is not moving exactly chronologically, but I'm trying to give you several examples of ways that Southern states still resisted Reconstruction policy. All Southern states had slave codes before the war. That would be, a series of laws that would have to do with slaves. And now many of those are just changed into black codes after the war. Some of these were just simple changes in the law to recognize that when a black man and woman get married, it is a legitimate marriage now. Under slave codes, they wouldn't have really recognized that as a real legal union, and slave owners could break up marriages and sell people in different directions if they wanted. But the black codes now are going to say, marriages between African Americans, that is a real marriage. But it'll also say some things to make sure that there's a separate set of laws and principles for freedmen than for the majority white population. Things like Um, Blacks cannot own guns. What about the Second Amendment? I thought we all had a right to bear arms. Well, no, they don't want former slaves armed and dangerous. So many states' black codes would forbid them from having guns, or it would forbid them from participating in courts. It would limit their testimony. And this varies from state to state because Mississippi would have their own black codes and Alabama would have theirs, and Louisiana, etc. But the black codes essentially were a way of creating a separate set of laws for the recently freed slaves, not giving them all the same rights as just the average white citizen. Another common theme in these black codes would say that blacks are required to carry with them a certificate of employment to show, where they are employed. They can't just roam around anywhere. They're going to be assumed to be up to no good or to be thieves. You have to show where you are employed. And in fact, often the place where freed slaves would be employed would be back at the same farms where they worked before. Only, before they worked for no cash. They just worked and had a place to live there, food, clothing, and shelter. Now they work for some of those same farms and they're not free to just move about. The landowner may keep these certificates of employment, and now they're really not free to just move away. If that employer wanted to hold on to that certificate, they'll be considered a vagrant if they go anywhere else, just troublemaker. So the Black Codes really limits the rights of these recently freed slaves. Another way that life didn't change that much immediately after the Civil War is that most of the freed slaves were now working as either sharecroppers or tenant farmers. A tenant farmer just meant they rent someone's land and then they work the farm there. So they get some benefit of whatever they can grow on their own there, but they are paying the landowner for the right of using that land. They're tenants, they're renters. Now, those were the lucky ones. If you had made enough money or you had some cash on hand where you could actually pay for the use of land, it was more common for some of these freed slaves to be sharecroppers. That meant you have no cash to rent someone's land. A sharecropper just agrees to work on the land and will share part of the crops with the landowner. Whatever contract they have worked out in advance, 50% of the crops may belong to the landowner, with the sharecropper doing the work. So that could really be a problem. That could really keep you almost in a state of slavery because, although there's not, an overseer coming to whip or discipline slaves as they may have experienced before, they work on their own, but then they're constantly falling further in debt. They don't have cash. They have a little bit of crops, some of which they share with the owner, some they can sell. But where are they going to get the money to start planting, to have the seed, or to have the equipment to start harvesting? Much of that they have to borrow from the landowner, or where they shop. They're going to be probably shopping at a place owned by the landowner. So this isn't exactly a form of Southern resistance. Maybe I've misplaced this on the outline, but being a sharecropper or even tenant farmer did keep freed slaves in a perpetual state of dependence and debt. It meant things haven't completely changed. I'm going to skip around a little bit here. I don't have these in the best order, but another way that there was great resistance to Reconstruction was through voting restrictions. Southern states, in different ways, would create poll taxes, a tax on voting. Now, if you have plenty of money, then maybe it's not such a big deal to pay a small fee to be able to vote. But if you are already very poor, then a poll tax might be a deterrent. You might decide it's not worth voting. I'd rather eat. Um, and so a poll tax was a way that might keep a lot of poor freedmen from participating in the vote. Another type of restriction would be through literacy tests. If you have to pass a literacy test in order to vote, that can keep a lot of uneducated people who haven't had an opportunity for education, that can keep a lot of them from voting. Now, on the surface, if you just take race out of it, if you just said, hey, people should be better educated before they cast a vote, you could probably make a pretty good argument for that. I would listen. I think there's a lot of people who don't really know what they're talking about, but they just vote anyway. But these were not simply restrictions to make sure that we have an educated electorate. This was especially to try to keep certain kinds of people from voting, because they would often have two different types of tests. There's the white test and the black test. There's a lot of very uneducated whites in the South at this time too. Just the average guy, maybe an Andrew Johnson type before he learned to read. They're not going to be able to pass a really difficult literacy test. So a lot of states might have two different versions of a literacy test. The one for the poor whites is just very, very basic. And the one for freed slaves might ask you to read a portion of a state constitution and interpret what it means. Well, you read what lawyers write, it's hard to understand what they are saying. You can have graduate degrees, and lawyer speak is still, partly to reveal and partly to obscure. It's very complex. Then states would also have things called a grandfather clause. Many states would now say, if your grandfather voted in 1865, then you're exempt from the poll tax and you're exempt from the literacy test. Well, that's kind of the most bold and obvious way of saying we're trying to limit how many Black people vote, because a white person's grandfather was voting then in 1865. So this could exempt a poor white person from the poll tax, which they can't afford, or the literacy test, which they might not be able to pass. But it does not exempt the Black voter, because their grandfathers were not voting in 1865. So several ways, again, this varies from state to state, but there's lots of ways that these Southern states kept Blacks from really fully participating in politics. And if all of those ways failed, if they somehow could still pay the poll tax, still pass the literacy test, the Ku Klux Klan would be another source to keep Blacks from voting. The Klan was an organization that was born in this era of Reconstruction. Just after the Civil War, some veterans of the Civil War, some of those of the Confederate Army, put together this organization. Their infamous first founder was Nathan Bedford Forrest. He's a controversial figure because he does still have some defenders who say that not all of what the Klan does later really reflects Nathan Bedford Forrest. But he was universally known as a tough fighter in the Civil War. He's one of the best cavalry leaders of the Confederacy. He is a very tough, wiry kind of guy, skinny, but tough. He, one time he's riding to escape the Union Army, and he picks up a Union soldier on his horse and uses him as a shield. So, they can't shoot at him, and then he tosses him aside when he's gone to safety. Forrest also was involved in a battle where his men continued to kill people even after they seemed to be ready to surrender. This is called the Fort Pillow Massacre. And It was basically black soldiers. A lot of Union black soldiers were being killed. Nathan Bedford Forrest would just say, hey, this was war. A lot of people are being killed. Some people would look back and say, well, this was also his racism. He's not going to allow a black soldier to just surrender. They are treated inhumanely. They're not going to have the respect of just a soldier. They're going to be killed. So Forrest starts this fraternal organization, this Ku Klux Klan. He's not going to stay in it very long, but through the late 1860s into the 1870s, the Klan will make it their mission to prevent former slaves from voting and prevent anyone really from voting for the Republicans. Okay, the Democratic Party is who the Ku Klux Klan was associated with in the 1860s and 70s. They are trying to intimidate and terrorize freed slaves to discourage them from voting. So under President Ulysses S. Grant, he's coming after one term of Andrew Johnson, Grant knew we have a continual problem because the Klan and similar organizations are continuing to fight and target African Americans in the South. And they can be pretty elusive. They don't always have, there's enough people of the community that are part of them, or at least sympathetic to them, then their activities don't always have willing eyewitnesses to testify against them. And the federal government's going to make a law against this organization. We'll have anti-Ku Klux Klan laws, forbidding people from wearing masks in public like this. That's one of the things they would do, is obscure their identity and then go burn houses or scare people away from the polls. Well, even after the federal government outlaws this organization, they will just kind of take other forms or take other names. One local area had an organization called Mother's Little Helpers. Sounds like a very calm organization. We're just here to help mom. But it was just another version of the Klan. I read about another one called the Allendale Mounted Baseball Club. That's a creative name, but we're just a baseball team who rides horses. That's why we're on horseback and we have baseball bats. Well, they're not playing baseball. They're intimidating and beating up or killing those that they don't want to vote Republican. So they're targeting the freed slaves, black citizens now, and anyone else who has Republican sympathies. Some of these people who have moved from the North and now live in the South, these carpetbaggers, is what they're called derisively, or people in the South who now have joined this Republican Party. And at least according to Klansmen, they're the most despised of all, because they've turned their backs on the Confederacy. They've joined Abraham Lincoln's party. Those scalawags, those scruffy little horses. The Klan is going to intimidate and really prevent a lot of voting in the South. Now, one by one, these states in the South start to be readmitted into the Union. And when they are readmitted into the Union, they very quickly, once they are readmitted back in the Union, they no longer have soldiers there and no longer have so many restrictions on who can vote, whether or not you were a Confederate soldier or not. When new state constitutions go into effect and they're fully back in the Union, they all revert back to the Democratic Party. They elect Democratic governors, Democratic local legislature, and Confederate states would call this redeeming their governments. They've gone back to the way it should be. Democrats are back in charge. So when you see this term redeemer governments, it refers to states who were under Reconstruction. Now that they've been readmitted into the Union, the Democrats are back in charge shortly after. So this last point here, I know I've gone out of order, but the last point moves us really a little beyond Reconstruction, but still related and important point to make here. After the Civil War, racial segregation was as strong, if not stronger, than it had been under slavery. All of these Confederate states are going to have strict rules about where whites can be and where blacks can be. They're going to try to limit the interaction between these populations. Different parts of any public facility. And so this is called, Jim Crow laws to separate whites and blacks in all public areas. And all of these Southern governments did this in the 1870s and 80s. And finally, in the 1890s, there's a Supreme Court case that involves this. Is it legal to keep whites and blacks separated in restaurants or any public facility or on trains? That's the case of Plessy versus Ferguson. Homer Plessy was a black man, at least by their definitions of what makes someone a black man. What if you're of mixed ancestry? What if you had a grandparent who was black, but all of your other, all the rest of your immediate family, they were white? You may be darker complected. You might show some signs. Okay, yes, there must be some African American in this family, but more than 50% of the person's ancestry is really not black. So I know these are uncomfortable things to talk about now, but in the 1860s and 70s, they would talk very openly about the sin of this amalgamation, different races blended together. Well, Homer Plessy was technically a black man, but it was more like 1/8 of his ancestry. He's a very light-skinned black man, making him a perfect example to test these segregation rules. Should he have to sit in a separate part of the railroad car because, a couple of generations back, there's a black person in his family, making him technically, enough African American for them to consider him black? Well, that's the case. Can a railroad company have separate cars, separate sections of cars for blacks and for whites? The Supreme Court in 1896 says, yes, it is legal to separate the races as long as you're separating them, but the opportunity to ride the train is separate but equal. It would be illegal to say blacks can't ride the train, period. As long as they still have a way to ride the train, they still enjoy the benefits of this public service, there's nothing illegal, according to the court in 1896, nothing illegal about having separate seating for white and black. Now, like I said, this goes beyond our 1877 end of Reconstruction, but this is related because it has to do with the legality of racial segregation. It went on already through Reconstruction, and now the Supreme Court even sanctions it and says, yes, that is okay. Separate, but equal. Now, if you do some more US history study, you'll know that gets reversed in the 1950s. But at least at one point, this is what the Supreme Court says. And it's another lesson that we should keep in mind, what the Supreme Court says in any one period or another, may or may not be what is just and what is right. The Supreme Court's still made up of fallible human beings, and they can be wrong. We can take a lot of Supreme Court cases and say, that's what they said then, but perhaps now that should be re-looked at. But we'll finish this sticking with Reconstruction here and not speculating on other court cases. So we come to 1876. Ulysses S. Grant has been president for 2 terms. He's very popular, obviously, as a Union general, but had quite a tumultuous presidency, partly because of scandals of other people. His cabinet, his advisors are involved in a lot of corruption. So it's not really remembered as a great president the way he was a great general. But in 1876, Reconstruction was still going on. There were still a few states that had military rule there. And so here's another election taking place. And this is a very close election. There's more of those Confederate states back in the Union by this time, so they are able to vote. And the race comes down to the Democrat, Samuel Tilden. He's not a Southern Democrat. This is a New York Democrat. And an Ohio Republican named Rutherford B. Hayes. Hayes was also an officer in the Civil War. He had fought for the Union. Not as well known as Ulysses S. Grant, but he is a general from that war. So a very close election here between Tilden and Hayes. And at the end of this election, there were 3 states whose returns still seemed very questionable. There were lots of reports of corruption and people, stuffing the ballot box or running off with a ballot box and hiding votes. So there's going to be an investigation to find out who really won in those 3 remaining states. Florida is one of them. That's usually there. If there's some mystery about who won in a state, Florida always seems to be one of those. But in this case, it's not just Florida, but 3 states whose electoral votes are really in question. Now, if you add up the 3 states, their electoral votes would represent 20 votes. And so Congress put together a commission, a bipartisan committee. So it's got Republicans and Democrats to investigate each of these states and find out who really won there. Well, it's a bipartisan group, 7 Democrats and 8 Republicans in the committee. Which way do you think they're going to lean? This committee decides that in all 3 cases, Hayes was really the winner. And so 20 new electoral votes are going to Hayes, and that would erase the 19 vote lead Samuel Tilden had. This is a very controversial election. Democrats are livid, not just in the South, but all through the North as well. They feel this was a stolen election. And, many are already talking about war again. So the 2 sides have to come together and try to compromise so that it is short of war. Rutherford B. Hayes says, look, we'll do a lot of things to try to make this transition easier for Democrats and for the South. Okay, we will make sure that there's more investment in the South, railroad development there. And the ultimate compromise was we'll end Reconstruction in the South. The last remaining soldiers will come home. Those last remaining states will come into the Union. They are in, and Reconstruction will be over. See, Reconstruction doesn't really come to an end because some great goal had been achieved. It's not because the federal government said African Americans are really well respected and they're reasonably safe. Everything is ready to go back to normal. No, we never reach that goal or some other goal to say Reconstruction should just be over. It was just declared over because we had this very controversial election, which might have led to more violence. Rutherford B. Hayes just says Reconstruction will be over. So he becomes the next president, and Reconstruction is done in 1877. So Reconstruction is not one of those things that we see a lot of monuments to. There's lots of Civil War monuments. They're quite controversial now. We see challenges or defacing these monuments, or sometimes pressure to remove things commemorating the Civil War. if they're Confederate monuments. But Reconstruction has no similar celebration of this whole time. It's pretty much seen as a failure, but we may just disagree on what exactly makes it a failure. Let me just end with one comment about Reconstruction history. In the early 20th century, the main scholar, the leading scholar on Reconstruction, his name was William Dunning. He taught at Columbia University in New York. So this is a historian. He's part of my group. William Dunning was a historian at Columbia, and he trained many of the future great scholars of Civil War and Reconstruction history. Now, his overall interpretation, I'm simplifying, because he would write, things much, much longer than I can explain in a minute or two. But his overall interpretation of Reconstruction was it was a failure, it was a tragedy, because the Union shouldn't have even tried to do some of the things they did. His interpretation would be that the tragedy was there's lots of corruption in these Reconstruction governments. The Union, radical Republicans, try to force the South to make a lot of changes, and they're faced with all this resistance. They generate the resistance. And really, there was so much corruption and an attempt to basically turn the world upside down, to put the black soldiers now on top and big plantation owners down at the bottom. And William Dunning and others would say they shouldn't have tried to do that. Reconstruction politicians were wrong. Now, keep in mind, this is an interpretation. It's not coming out of Mississippi or Alabama. This is New York. This is the main interpretation of Reconstruction in the early 20th century. The William Dunning interpretation was very sympathetic to the South, very critical of the North. It seemed that the whole nation even had kind of accepted, or at least become more sympathetic to the Southern point of view. Now, another 100 years later, and it didn't take 100 years, but from the 1960s onward, we've seen a definite shift in Reconstruction history. Historians of Reconstruction now don't talk as much about the corruption and the failure of the Union, failure of Northern politicians. They would mainly say it's a failure because they didn't go far enough. They didn't do enough to guarantee freed slaves are going to actually be well protected, and their rights are going to be protected. But that was not the initial interpretation. Shortly after the Civil War, it was more the Southern view that prevailed. Early 21st century may be a very different view that would be more sympathetic to the radical Republicans, or even some who would say, yes, you can take someone's property from them in the name of justice and give it to someone else. Well, that's what I mean, at least, by the South winning the Civil War. They resist Reconstruction in so many ways. It is finally brought to an end, and it's not because everything had changed so much in the South. And in fact, the ways that they will tell Reconstruction history would sound very much like what the Confederacy would say immediately after the Civil War. So this is all I have to share about Reconstruction for right now. Hope this is beneficial to you. Study it well, and I'll see you next time.